like working within these bigger organizations as well, is that when you're trying to, and you might face this at your stations, like when you're trying to sell your idea and convince people why you want to have a podcast, I think having reasons outside of just like, it sounds like other podcasts can be really good, because I hope by the end of tonight we can kind of, if you've got an idea bubbling away in your head, we can think of other reasons why it really should be a podcast rather than, it sounds like this other podcast that exists. So what makes a good podcast? And yeah, these aren't rules, they can all be broken, but we know about the way that people listen to podcasts, which can help us think about what might make a good one. So they're often listened to in headphones, and people often listen to them alone, not universally. So I actually talked to Beth AQ on Triple R today, and she was telling me a story about like a workshop that she did a couple of weeks ago, where a participant told her that they listened to true crime podcasts out of like a speaker in their living room every evening with their family. Like they used to watch TV and now they sit around together and listen to podcasts. And I know that I listen to some podcasts when I'm driving in the car with my partner. Like we'll put on a podcast and there are certain podcasts we'll listen to that way. But all the research tells us that like the majority of people listen alone and they listen through headphones. And as radio broadcasters, like a lot of you will know that that's not how people listen to radio. So it's actually pretty unusual for people to listen to radio, just alone with their headphones. They'll listen, in the car or at the shops or in the house with it playing through speakers. So it actually is a really different way of listening, and it means that we can, use that to our advantage, I suppose. Listening to podcasts on digital radio in the kitchen while cooking, that's also something I do. It only, I think my podcast taste when I'm cooking is a bit embarrassing. Like I definitely don't listen to stuff that I would want everyone to know. I listen to like Harry Potter recap podcasts when I'm cooking. So that's an interesting one for later in the questions. Can community radio stations utilize podcasts as income? Maybe we'll come back to that. I'll have a think about that. It's hard for anyone to use podcasts as income at the moment, so that's a tricky one to answer. So the thing about being able to, the audience self-selecting, is that you can target really niche topics if you'd like to. It's not a rule, you don't have to, but it just means that, my Harry Potter recap podcasts have an audience, whereas it would be a hard time convincing the ABC to produce Harry Potter recap podcasts. And they're really, like the Legal Centre, New South Wales Legal Centre now has a podcast. I worked with them the other week and it's really cool, but it's specifically for community workers and their lawyers, and they're always trying to communicate with community workers about how the law works and changes to the law. And now they have a podcast that specifically does that. And the thing about radio is, you'd have to communicate to community workers to tune in every week and listen to this thing for educational purposes. But a podcast means that you can do that over time. You can encourage people to listen in meetings, and you can also just get them directly, and they can subscribe and remember to listen to that every week at their own pace. The thing about a podcast too is that we know that people, they listen to the first, if you've got them past the first 3 minutes, they're going to listen to your whole podcast probably. So if you hook them in that beginning, then they're going to stick around, which is also different. So people kind of drift in and out of radio, and I know my listening habits mirror what's said in these studies. So if you're listening to a podcast, once you've invested a certain amount of time, you're I may as well get to the end, almost like a book or something, instead of it sort of being associated with place. And we also know that people come back. So they might put your podcast down when their commute ends, and then the next morning pick it back up again and keep listening. A good podcast weaves a good story. So, you do want to hook people in, and you do want them to keep listening and feel like there's a point to listening. And so I think something about even the best conversational podcasts, and this is true of a lot of them, have evolved from radio shows, is that they build narrative into even conversations that they're having, and make sure they're giving things momentum and pace. And, you know, they're always really strong, even if strong stories, even if it sounds like a conversation. And the other thing about making podcasts is that people develop relationships with their hosts over time, which isn't unique to podcasts. It's also true of radio. But the subscription model and having people sort of subscribe and identify as a listener of XYZ is really important for podcasts in a way that it is for community radio too, actually, which I think is like an advantage for you guys over some other radio stations and different media companies and things like that. You know, people really identify as FBI listeners or you know, Bay FM listeners, and you have this really strong membership culture already. And so I think that that like having hosts that you can get to know over time really ties into that. It's like people are coming to get you, and they know what they're getting. And you kind of develop these. I know people often say to me that they feel like they have in-jokes with their podcast hosts, and you know, they'll start telling you some story that they heard on a podcast that they think is really funny, and it doesn't translate because you haven't spent like hours and hours and hours with their hosts like they have. So that's something to remember as well, is thinking about what makes a good host and how you can kind of evolve that relationship over time. So one thing about working in radio or working in other media and then creating a podcast is like it seems like there's a lot of freedom and you can do anything you want. It's just this blank slate, and you know, there's no clock to, you know, there's no news to time out to, or there's no show coming up after yours, so why don't we just go nuts and do it forever? But there's still limitations, and they're kind of like a cage of your own making. So you're still really confined by your audience's expectations of your show and of you, and like a certain amount of consistency the audience really expects. So I learnt this kind of the hard way with the party room, which we'll talk about, you know, after this as like a case study. But I really learnt that audience expectations, I was free from the broadcast clock, and I was working with two traditional broadcasters who were really like, oh wow, we can go crazy now. But the audience really grew to like depend on getting the show at a certain time. Like if it wasn't available on a Thursday afternoon, they get really annoyed. And people would send pictures of like being on their tractor, and they didn't have their podcast, and that was the time of day that they were out on their tractor, and they were really annoyed that they'd built this habit and then we'd disappointed them. And they also have expectations around how long it will go for. So, you know, once we did an episode that was shorter than a normal episode, and similar people were like, oh, where's that, you know, it didn't fill up my commute home, or something like that. So even though you're kind of free from these things that we're used to being constraints in radio, you still have these constraints that are different, and you just have to kind of feel your way and learn what they are. But a really big one is workflow. And I think that when we're designing podcasts alongside other production that's going on, it's really important to think at the start of how it's going to fit into your workflow. And there's a couple of models which we're going to talk about soon and that's why the title of this webinar is quite, you know, it's got both in it. It's either you're creating a podcast that could go on air, like something that's a really strong podcast product that could go on air, or you're taking what you've just done in your radio show and turning it into a really strong podcast. But I think that at the core of that is looking at your workflow and how you produce things, and what you're already doing, and then designing a podcast format and content around, you know, what would be good and what would fit in with that. So like, don't make things too hard for yourself. And even if you've got a really, really good podcast idea, maybe think about like how you can use it to make your current life easy. You know, if you have a show that goes for 3 hours in the afternoon, but you also have a podcast that you want to do about, you know, horses, like, is there a way to incorporate that content that you're doing? You know, maybe you start interviewing people on your show about horses, and you have a segment about horses. I've used a terrible example now, I can't get out of it, but like Or you could go the other way and you could create this, 7-minute podcast that comes out once a week, and you also get to play it in your show. So just thinking about like realistically how long it takes you to make things, and it's all pre-recorded content. So we kind of know that often takes more time, or definitely takes more time. And so, yeah, just like working in to your life and your work, how that might pan out right from the start, instead of kind of being like, oh no, I've got to do my podcast now, because otherwise it just becomes the thing that you hate, which podcast should never be. And the other thing is, like, there are these rules of radio that people coming to podcasts from outside radio are always going to mimic, because their experience of audio is really different to yours as audio makers. And so I think when you're creating a podcast, think about like what you've learnt at community radio and what you've learnt about like why we do certain things, and then think about whether or not you need that in the podcast. So a really good example is the reset. So when you're resetting and sort of telling people what they're listening to and recapping what they just heard, or coming off the back of a song or something and doing a station ID, that's all the sort of stuff that's really, really important when you're doing a radio show. But when you're listening to a podcast, like, no one's accidentally coming in the middle. So yeah, like, do you need to reset, or do you need to remind people that they're listening to your podcast? Or do they know? Like, that's sort of why you hear these long 60-minute uninterrupted conversations where no one's reminding you what we're talking about or anything like that. But then again, like, you're not free from it entirely. Like, people still need to know, like, what if you go off on a tangent, you still need to remind people, like, oh, we're actually talking about blah. And still need to guide people through that conversation, even if it's not the traditional like radio style reset or radio style signposting. I think I'm going to take some questions soon. And yeah, this is something that that I was talking about before as well. So like, why should your podcast exist, and how are you going to convince people to listen to it? So the advantage you have as broadcasters is that people are going to accidentally find you. They'll stumble upon your show and then they'll be like, oh, Mum, I've got this great show. You really need to listen to it. But that's never going to happen for your podcast. Like, no one's going to accidentally, it's really rare for someone to accidentally stumble upon an audio show, sorry, a podcast show. But they, they're not going to, unless they're kind of just browsing through iTunes, which sometimes happens, but there's so many out there that people really trust, like direct recommendations, or going on another podcast and recommending your podcast, or going on a radio show and recommending your podcast. So yeah, coming up with like a really strong sell for why it should exist and why it should be a podcast, and then convincing people to listen to it. Sorry, Danny, did you just turn your microphone on?
That was me.
What was Jodie?
Yeah, we can go to questions whenever you want, Jess. So just there's a bunch of stuff that's come up in the Q&A already, but let us know when you're ready. Danny's just having some audio problems, so I can guide people through it if you like.
Oh, cool. Let me have a look.
If you have a question, pop it into the Q&A. We've got some good ones coming up in there, and Jess is just going to go through and have a look and answer them. I see all the usual suspects showing up in there, Jess.
Yeah, so this is a good one from Vic, and then sort of supplemented by Matt, which is it correct that a podcast can contain 80% music and 20% talk? And yeah, if it's a music podcast, a la Song Exploder. So this one's a really tricky one, and it just depends on your on your station's license and on like how podcasting works within that. So as independent podcasters, it's like a real problem, which is dealing with music licensing, and it's something that all stations deal with really differently, and something that, like, even just having come from the ABC last year, like, they haven't nailed it yet. They're still really focused on broadcast, and then podcast is a bit of an afterthought with some problems. So yeah, it's about finding out, and Geordie, you might have some more info on this as well, like how community broadcasters deal with questions like this. I remember at All the Best, there were certain, it was less about percentages and more about just the sort of music that we were using, and I think like the length of the commercial music we were using as opposed to production music. But there are some really cool like free production music websites as well with like Creative Commons licensing, which I can chuck a link to one in the comments. But yeah, Geordie, do you want to have a chat about that?
I guess the main thing to check in relation to that is what your radio station's license says. So a lot of community radio stations now have on-demand streaming licenses and podcast licenses packaged into their license. Danny's listening too, so he's someone you can actually call at the CBAA to talk a little bit about your particular station and what's licensed there. So that's something, if it's going to be hosted on your station's website and goes out through your station's sort of channels. For the National Features and Documentary Series podcast that we do every year, we host our podcasts on third-party podcast platforms, so something like SoundCloud or Whooshka. And generally what happens there is that even though we're a community radio and we have the license to do that, to put copyrighted music in our podcasts, we usually get taken off for things like SoundCloud, because they have bots that will automatically go through and pretty much take down anything with copyrighted music in them. So you kind of have to go through a process with them to let them know that you have permission. So it can be really tricky, and I think the best way to go is to talk to your station manager about what the license is, the special license that you have. If your station doesn't have it, yes, you can get it. Vic has just asked that. You can apply for a special license. Most of the time it's packaged in with your normal license at the moment, so it's something worthwhile checking out. And I'd recommend giving CBAA a call to get some details on how to go about that.
Yeah, it's also you can do some really cool stuff with production music as well. And I think that the question about Song Exploder is really interesting, because there aren't that many good music podcasts, and listening to even what Spotify, who are really getting into podcasting now, what they're putting out, like even they don't really use much music, and they just sort of license everything as it comes. It's a really different way of using music than just streaming and listening to it. And Song Exploder's really, I think, like thrown everyone because they do have such close relationships with the artists, and do the licensing that's like the level above the artists, like for each song. And so people listen to Song Exploder and get really excited about what's possible, and it's just like a really unique case. So it is hard to do like podcasts that focus on commercial music. It's definitely something that radio does much better. What else have we got here? So yeah, in Bendigo, so this is from Brad, Radio KLFM in Bendigo. We use our podcasts as a catch-up service of items we have broadcast. Interested to know your thoughts. Exclusive podcast content versus catch-up from the broadcast service. So this is a really good question, and it's a way that a lot of radio stations use podcasts, and I don't think it's a bad way at all. And there's some tricks that you can do to like make it really optimized for the podcast. And we'll talk about some of them after we take some questions, and I'll talk through some case studies. But I think that there's just like a tiny bit of there's ways you can record your show so that you're making it sound like it's fresh, and you're making it sound like it's made for podcast, and sort of some like tricks around that. And I think that often we think of, like, I know when I've been in those situations where I've been podcasting shows that have gone up, it actually takes like a bit of work. It's extra work. And you don't really realize that the audiences are really different. So often your audience from the radio isn't going and catching up in the podcast feed. They're like catching up on next week's show or something like that. And often you're finding this new audience with podcasts. So it's just about like working out, if it's something that you want to be doing, and like putting this extra time into, or if you want to be like serving that audience in a different way, or maybe with like a different version of the same show. But yeah, it's definitely like there's nothing wrong with using it as catch up. It's like just optimizing it so that you're making the most of that stuff that you've already made. Geordie, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it'd be great to see some examples and some case studies of that, because I think that that's a huge kind of evolutionary point in podcasting, and where we move from the idea of on-demand catch-up through to what is actually podcasting.
Yeah, it's interesting because like 5 years ago at the ABC, I remember they really wanted to delete, just like mass delete there were 400 ABC podcasts, and they wanted to just mass delete all of the catch-up audio. But it was really like kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because, for instance, like Conversations is a radio show and it's it was their most popular podcast. And you think about This American Life, which is a radio show and for a long time was just put up really similar to what went to air on the radio. So it's not always a bad thing. It's just thinking about like what makes a good podcast and what makes a good radio show. Yeah, Mel's just put in the comments, interviews can be made into a catch-up podcast, which is interviews like make really good podcasts, and it's just about packaging them. Like maybe you don't need like maybe you've got music in the interview show and you're going to have licensing problems, so it's just about thinking about those different, or maybe the intro is going to be different on the podcast as it's going to be on your radio show. It's just about like thinking about those small changes that we can make to our radio shows to make them really suitable for podcast.
Great. Do you want to kick on now, Jess, and we'll come back to some questions later? Or?
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Okay, cool. And I might pop in if there's any in this list, because it's really firing, which is really awesome to see. But if there's any in this list that I might be able to answer, I might just pop in and make some notes in here. But I'll leave the ones that everyone might want to see to you.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Am I still sharing my screen? Yes.
Yes.
You can still see it. So the first case study, which I've already mentioned, is the party room. So this came about because the ABC really wanted a politics podcast, and we really wanted to use like the resources that we had to create one instead of creating something totally new. But the problem with podcasting, something that, podcasting Iron Breakfast and podcasting Iron Drive, which do exist as like catch-up podcasts, but their listenership isn't as big as something that's made directly for podcasts could be. And so the problem that we wanted to solve was like, how do we turn these shows into a really good politics podcast? And it was in the lead up to election time. The solution was the party room. And so it was, we could have edited interviews or something from those shows, but instead we went with a whole new program. And it was designed, going back to workflow, it was designed around like the time of day, which was 10:30 in the morning, where the breakfast announcer, Fran Kelly, and then the drive announcer, Patricia Carvelis, would be both at work, and they could get in a studio together and record something. And the good thing about it was like using preparation that they'd already done for their existing shows. So they were always on the phone to politicians and always researching and like trying to find scoops and like trying to find new news about politics. And there was always heaps that like we'd have to stop them putting onto Breakfast and Drive. Like it's just only so much you can get through in interviews, which is the style of those shows. And so the party room came about as a chance for them to kind of like talk about what they learned through the week, and also sort of highlight other people at the station, highlight other people at ABC who also had expertise. But it was made specifically for podcasts. So if you listen, they're like, they sound very different to how they sound when they're broadcasting. But I mean, the thing about that is that like it's a little bit psychological. So the things that they're doing in the podcast, where they're kind of sounding a little bit more like casual and intimate, like again, that's kind of often put up as like a podcast rule, is that you've got to sound, like you're talking to your best friend or something. I don't think that's universally true, but in this case, that's the style that we went for, was them talking to each other in a more casual way, because it differentiated it from that Breakfast and Drive show. So it's like, it's a whole new show. It's not catch up. It's like a completely new thing. And it went really well. And the really good thing about it was, which I think is really relevant for you guys, is that it found a new audience, and then it brought those people into Breakfast and Drive. So there was always a real, and I think there still is, like a real competitiveness around podcasting and traditional broadcast. especially within the ABC. And yeah, it kind of like helped with that, because we were able to go like, yeah, we're putting resources into this new podcast project, but it actually is helping the broadcast outcomes as well. And it meant that like people who were like dedicated Fran listeners or dedicated Patricia listeners, like listen to this and then learn about the other person's show. And, you know, we're promoting it on both shows. So it was like a real success story in terms of creating something totally new that, like, you know, it wasn't taking away time from those shows, but it was adding to them, which was really cool. So the next show I'm going to talk about is the hookup, which I haven't worked on, but I've heard a lot about how it's produced and like the process that they went through to change what they do. And I think it's really interesting for you guys. So it's a show on Triple J about dating and sex, and like an advice show. And what they used to do was catch up audio. So they'd take what was broadcast and then they'd put it up afterwards. And they'd do it all on a Sunday night, I think, or the Monday morning. Like they would broadcast it on the Sunday and then almost immediately turn it into a podcast and put up whatever went to air with like a little bit of editing. And how they changed it was they wound up like, they did a lot of development work and they stopped and went like, what would a podcast audience want the hookup to sound like? Like, what are they getting from it? And why are the people who are coming to the podcast feed coming there to listen to it? And they thought, like, you know, there are lots of reasons that you might want to listen to the sex and dating show as a podcast, just because you have that privacy of, you know, sitting there with your phone whenever you want, whenever you have privacy and listening to it. So, yeah, what they did was interesting. They take what's on the show on the Sunday night, and instead of just immediately making it a podcast, they take a few days and produce what the content that they have. And turn that into a podcast, into 2 podcast episodes through the week. So it's kind of cool because they, I mean, like in terms of just numbers, they've doubled their listener numbers, which is absurd. But that's what happens when you start making 2 episodes a week when you used to have 1. But they took, you know, maybe one popular segment about blind dates or something, and then they would turn that into episode 1, and then maybe like cutting some different music or you know, just like change how the intro happens. And I think re-recording intros and outros is like a really popular way to repackage something that's gone to air for podcast. And yeah, and then they broadcast those 2, like they podcast one on a Tuesday and one on a Thursday or something like that. So I think it's a really good model if you're thinking about taking a show that is really popular on air, but maybe not doing so well as catch-up audio, and then like changing it just in little ways. And also made their Sunday nights or their Monday mornings less stressful, because they weren't just like doing all the admin of getting their podcast up. They could like take some time and make it really good. Actually, and another one that I wanted to mention, which I don't have a slide for, but which occurred to me today, is Sleep Talker, which is at Triple R, and it's a program by Beck Fari, who used to do it as a podcast. So this is like going the other way. It's like a really good podcast, and she's just rethought the program to make it a really strong radio show. So I think that's like, and if you listen to both of them, it's kind of an interesting study in what makes a good podcast and what makes a good radio show. I think she does it really well. In that the podcast is, they sound really similar, but the podcast plays to podcast's advantages. So they're all different lengths and they're very produced and, you know, sort of these stories with lots of different voices in them, or interviews with her voice woven in and out of them. Whereas the radio show really plays to the live radio element, and she's there in the middle of the night at the Triple R studios, like mixing strange, you know, sound beds and music together and doing these interviews about sleep and being in the middle of the night. And I just think that it's a really cool way to think about, you know, what's so great about radio, and she's just like making such a cool show for like specifically made for radio. So yeah, if you love podcasting or radio, like I think both shows are equally good, just in totally different ways, which is really cool. So this is another model, and someone in the comments earlier mentioned WNYC. And this is an older show of theirs called TLDR. And it's really interesting because it used to be housed within a larger show, which I think is a really common way to make a podcast at a radio station, and like a really clever way. Because a podcast is like essentially pre-recorded radio of all different lengths. And so when you think about like what you might have pre-recorded on your show, often it could make a really good podcast. And so yeah, TLDR was that. It's now the people who made it now do Reply All, which is a Gimlet show about the internet. And so it was these like short produced stories investigating something from the internet within a bigger show, which was more of a magazine or chat style show called On the Media. So it was really cool. They all went for like maybe 9 to 17 minutes. And it was a real success. I used to listen to it more than I listened to the main show, which was like longer, about 60 minutes. And I think it's, if you're looking for sort of permission within your station or like backing within your station to make a podcast, this can be a really clever way to start. Like they now have their own show, and it's a full length 35, 40 minutes every fortnight, I think, as part of Gimlet. And it all came, like, it's pretty much the same show. It all came from this segment within a larger show. And if you listen to TLDR, you wouldn't know that it was a segment. You'd think it was like a whole podcast. So I think that's like a really good case study as well to have listened to. They all still exist. But in terms of repurposing shows that you have on air, like there are some easy ways to do it. Like maybe you have, someone mentioned an interview earlier. So like maybe you had a really strong interview, or maybe from your show that day you pick your strongest interview, or like 2 of your strongest interviews. Or maybe each week you're talking to different people, and each week you pick like your 3 strongest interviews. And I would really recommend like taking that stuff that you've already created for your show and then thinking about like which would make the best podcast, and then finding a format that you can use like week after week or fortnight after fortnight to like turn that content into a podcast instead of putting everything up as it went to air. And a little bit of that is about what we talked about earlier about like holding their attention at the start. And if you want to hold people's attention for those first 2 or 3 minutes, you likely want to re-record the intro, and maybe it's just that you, or at least edit the intro, because maybe you were like thanking the previous announcer, or talking about the music you just came off, or something like that, and you want to really come in strong and tell people what your podcast is, and who you're going to be talking to today, and really bring them along with you so that they stay and listen. So we've got about 10 minutes for more questions.
Sure. We've got a couple of questions, Jess, around the idea of promotion, increasing audience, the podcast as income. So maybe we could address a couple of those, if that's
yeah.
all right.
Sure.
So the top of the list is Pip's comment: can community radio stations utilise podcasts as income? I think it'd be interesting to hear your take on that.
Yeah, so I think everyone at the moment has trouble utilising podcasts as income or working out how to like monetize podcasts, but there are ways to do it. And I think it just depends on your station and like how it's set up. And really interesting, like a lot of podcasts run off a model that's similar to community radio stations and how they work. So like a model where people will subscribe or become a member, or these sort of like listener driven donations. So that's similar. There are drives in podcast land really similar to community radio land, that a lot of stations do that as well, and a lot of podcasts do that. So like that's a way to do it. And I mean, you could obviously, like, that podcast with their dedicated listenership would help those drives as well. So I don't think it's necessarily like a bad thing. But in terms of like ads or sponsorship or something like that, like I know that some shows like have found sponsorship kind of like through their stations, and through their stations like talking to partners or sponsors and or selling ads. Like it is possible to sell ads within podcasts. And I think that podcasts are like, there's a lot of research at the moment around like how good a sell podcasts are for advertisers, and it's kind of like a glamorous like area of advertising at the moment. So like if there's a time to make money off podcasts, then like in Australia maybe it's like coming. But it's because they're like a really engaged audience, and because of that self-selecting audience. So like I mentioned before about that legal service one for community workers, it's like if you had a product and you really wanted community workers to buy your product, it would be a really good sell for that podcast to go to you and be like, my audience is only community workers. There are 300 of them every week and they're going to be listening to your thing. Like that's really easy, whereas it's harder to know who our broadcast audience is. So yeah, I think there's definitely opportunities there, but yeah, it would also depend on like your station's values around the sort of advertisers that they go after or partners that they have and how all that works. So I don't know. Do you know any examples? I mean, All the Best has a partner at the moment, I think.
It's got a partner. It's got some sponsorship. I think the Think series at 2SER is a great example of a partnership with the university, with a particular department in the university to create the content. And, you know, they were able to actually kind of fund a little podcasting studio out of that as well. So I think it's definitely worthwhile thinking about what partnerships, if you're in a community radio, what partnerships you could create. I know there's been some talk particularly around some of the stations that are for radio reading services, so the RPH stations, the podcast content they can create for people with varying disabilities and how they might be able to attract sponsorship and funds for that, because it's quite a niche audience. So yeah, it's definitely something worth having a conversation about if you're talking about sponsorship and fundraising within your organization. You know, podcasting is a product that you guys can make.
And there's actually some really good stats. Like I think it's Triton Digital and Podcast One did like I'll try and find it and send it, but it's if you Google like Podcast One Australia podcast stats, they've got this deck that they use to sell podcasts to advertisers, like just podcasting as a medium to advertisers. And I found it really useful to take like the information that they're giving people and use it to sell, you know, to convince people about how to sell podcasts. So like it could help you convince your station or like people that you're asking for partnerships from. And it's often about like there's a lot of good studies into like good info in there on calls to action in podcasts, and like people in podcasts will tell you to do something and how many people actually go and do that thing, which might be like click on a website or it might be like buy my thing. So it's really good research to like, you know, boost that for you.
And I think that's the interesting thing you just mentioned there, Jess, about this idea of interactivity and podcasts, because of their nature of being online, downloadable, and we can track audience engagement so much better than we can for community radio listenership. So that becomes, you know, something that can be really worthwhile. You get this hard data that then you can share with sponsors and partners that you can't, you know, we've been kind of like just, you know, going through the kind of we've got 235,000 listeners for, is that your cat? Yeah. We've just been kind of going through, you know, the sort of audience surveys that we have for community radio are never like hard and fast like the stats that you can get for podcasts. So I might just pop through another couple of questions. Okay, let's have a look. What would be your recommendation post airing the show? Would you re-edit, then translate this to the RSS feed? Jody Sydney is asking.
Yeah, so I think I'd pick whatever's best for your show. So like one option is taking the audio that's gone to air and then re-editing it just like in little ways, which is what we used to do at RN Drive. So taking out references to time, it's really good to take out. Like you don't want to be doing time calls in your podcast because people could be listening to it at any time. It's good to take out even just like references to morning. Like on the party room, we used to have a lot of problems because Fran would just say like good morning, or you know, just references to it being the morning because that's all she's ever, you know, known. But you have to kind of like just imagine you're in this like vacuum of time and space for podcasts. So I would edit out those things. And then, you know, maybe just like change, you know, if there's anything you want to change about the levels or anything like that, and then save it as an MP3 and upload it as a podcast. Like that's definitely probably the most minimal way to do it. But I mean, maybe you want to take yeah, maybe you want to take your content from that whole week and take different bits of it. You know, just take like your best 3 interviews, and then get back in the studio and record your links together. So like, hey, you're listening to TLDR, like this is the podcast, you know, if you want to hear me on the radio, remember to listen at this time and this time. But like, this was the best interview I did this week, and like really grab them, and like come up with a new format that uses your content in that way that's like really strong. Or you could start like if you're, sorry, you go.
Sorry to say, just that kind of lights on Gemma Perv's question too. How do you use podcasts to increase your radio audience? So that idea of driving people back to your actual radio show through things that you say in your podcast.
Yeah, I think it's like really important to remember that they're usually really different audiences, and like they might have this big overlap in the middle, but they have different kind of characteristics, and like they're just a segment of your audience, and they're usually like expanding as well. Like people will have been recommended the show and never heard it on the radio, but be listening on your podcast. And so I think like pointing people to your radio show from the podcast is really valuable. But also like what we found with the party room was just having people, having presenters like in a different light or like in a different context, like opened up the idea of listening to that show for some listeners. Like the party room listeners were really like, oh, I'd never thought to listen to Drive, but now that I've heard Patricia on this show with Fran, like I'll go and try that. So that was really interesting to us, like the melding of the breakfast and Drive audiences. So yeah, like definitely like make sure you point to it, and keep telling people where you come from in your podcast. But also think about like the different guests you could have on your podcast, who might be able to promote, you know, like other shows at the station. And the thing is, like, if you want to promote your podcast, the best thing isn't to promote it on the radio, it's to promote it on other podcasts, because people who are listening to podcasts like usually are on their phone, like more often than not, and so they've got it already there with them, and if they hear a recommendation they just immediately go and might subscribe right there. So what you really want is to get on either like a radio show with a really big podcast listenership or like a podcast.
So doing a little promo there, that's a good one. That I think that answers Rebecca's questions in way, good ways to promote your podcast. So I'll tick that one off. We've got an interesting question here. I think it's an important one to answer. Chris asks from City Park Radio, do the normal broadcast laws apply to podcasts? Can claiming it to be satire avoid defamation, etc.?
Yep, all the laws apply. And the thing is, like, because we're listening to so many American shows, it's really hard because, and especially in independent podcasting, like lucky you guys have, you know, broadcast training, so you know what's legal and not legal. But yeah, it's like Wild West out here, and making podcasts that just could get them into real trouble. And we're listening to American stuff, so often we'll hear stuff and be like, oh, we could do that, and then you make it and you're like, oh, now I'm sued for defamation. So yeah, like you guys are definitely at the advantage in that you're not going to get sued because you know how the law works.
Because yeah, that's the training that we've had. Excellent. Okay, okay, let's see what else we've got here. Okay, Brad asked whether there's an ideal expiry time that they should come down, or should material just stay up?
I think it can stay up as long as like you're not embarrassed of it. I don't know, like I've only ever taken stuff down when I'm like, oh, this is dated terribly, but like it yeah, I don't, unless there's a licensing thing. Like I know some people take podcasts down because of maybe you have music licensing that that says you have to bring it down after a month or something. But I think that generally, and actually there's some like weekly or daily shows that will, like news shows that will take their podcast down after a week so people don't accidentally hear them and get the wrong information. But I think if you're doing something like that and you're worried about people accidentally hearing the wrong thing, you can start your show by being like, it's, you know, like the Daily, the New York Times podcast does start their podcast with the date. But yeah, I don't think you need to bring them down at all. You can just keep it going. And we kind of know, like, if your podcast isn't meant to be, like if the backlog's not meant to be listened to, people generally won't listen to it. But there's a way to structure your podcast feed either so it goes like front to back or back to front. So like if you have one of those series like Serial where you're meant to listen in order, you can have people listen in order. But yeah, I reckon just leave it up.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple of requests for some statistics or about popular podcasts and some links for podcast studies and research that's been done. So perhaps that's something you could share with us later, Jess, and we can post it out in the follow-up email.
Yeah, totally.
And the other question that's, I think this question, is quite interesting. It's from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, who owns the podcast?
It depends on your station, really, and it depends on like whatever agreement you have with your station. So if you're making it yourself, you own it. And like if you're making it outside of community radio and you're just making your own thing, and you're not employed by anyone who technically owns the stuff you make, then you own it. But it'll just depend on how you created it and who you created it with and how it's going out. So I think different stations probably have different agreements with people. Would you say that, Geordie?
Yeah, definitely. Generally, when we work on the National Features and Documentary Series, we have a copyright agreement that we sign with the producers where they retain copyright over the work, but the Community Radio Network has the first play rights. So they get to play it first on the Community Radio Network and it's put up on that podcast feed. And then if they want to sell it on or do something else with it, we go through a process usually of just a permissions process. Okay, great. Okay, let's just get through a couple more because we're just about to finish up. Now, let's say, as you said, there are no fast and hard rules, says Jody. Could it be that you have special interviews that you haven't aired on radio, but you add it into the podcast?
Yes, totally. So this is something we used to do all the time at Drive. Like if because your show is confined by like the radio clock and how much time you have, there can be stuff that doesn't fit. But the other thing, and then you might add it as an extra bonus episode or something. But the other thing that you could do is if, say you've got like a documentary show or something where things are like chopped up a bit more, maybe you have a bonus episode of your podcast where you can just have like a longer interview and you can hear all of it, which is, I always really like that when you hear the bits and then they just want to let the interview breathe and you get to hear the whole thing. So yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, that's not a rule that you have to do it, but like I like it.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's particularly if you've got someone that, maybe has like a particular following as well, and you only have a certain amount of time on your show, but then you can push it over to the podcast.
Yeah.
Okay, so Elaine is on there. She says, Elaine here, a special interview like an oral history. And I think, oral history is an interesting kind of concept for podcasting as well. Yeah,
it's funny because it's like, I feel like there's a lot of crossover in the methods of how people, because podcasts are all pre-recorded, like there's a lot of podcasts that are using oral history techniques and getting into that in a really big way and like learning from the oral history community. And there are also like oral historians making really cool podcasts. I'm actually just like talking to one today from Brazil who's doing a podcast, like an oral history audio project, which will eventually be a podcast about the oral history of their harbour there, which is really similar to Sydney Harbour, and talking to people who remember it from 100 years ago and like what it was like, and using like their oral historians who've become audio makers and using those techniques that they use to interview, which is, not something I'm trained in, but something that's really cool.
Great. Well, Elaine is a specialist in oral history, so you might want to get in touch with her. She's at Galari Media.
Awesome.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to have to round it up now. I will endeavour to answer just the last couple of questions in there, but Brad says to give your cat a pat for us.
She just ran away. I just tried to like get her in the screen.
And Chris did chime in and he said, check with Danny, but for licensing, APRA AMCOS do have an extra box to tick for podcasts on demand and an extra charge, whereas CBAA PPCA agreement does not include on demand and it has to be negotiated on the station-by-station basis. So Danny can definitely give you more information on that. Okay, I think we tried to get to just about everything we could. Was there anything else you wanted to finish with, Jess?
No, only to say that there was a session at last year's AudioCraft about like legal, like law and podcasting. which is recorded and you can listen to that. And some of it will be, it's for independent podcasters more than community broadcasters. So some of it won't be relevant, but like heaps of it is. So I can send that around as well. They, you know, it's lawyers talking about it, so they're like a lot smarter about that stuff than I am. And I've definitely broken some laws in my time by accident.
Good to get
but yeah,
yeah,
yeah, like come to Audiocraft, especially the CMTO workshops with Hindenburg are going to be really cool. And you know, it's like just cool to meet other podcasters and like find people to collaborate with.
So the dates for that, and it's in Sydney.
Yeah, it's in Sydney on June 1st.
June 1st. And I think our education day is actually on the Friday.
Yeah, Friday, May 31st is the first day, and then June 1st is the conference, and Sunday is June 2nd in the Botanic Gardens. And all those tickets are, online now. But the early birds will like sell out tonight. So I would just say that there's like 3 left. And the other thing is that if any of you are in regional areas and making podcasts, we've got a regional fellowship open for the next 10 days, I want to say, which is $500 towards travel plus a festival pass. And that's, used to support someone to come who's podcasting in a regional area who might not be able to come otherwise. So, definitely, it's a really simple application. It's just like a couple of questions in a Google form. So if you're keen, like, get on that.
Excellent. Jump onto audiocraft.com.au. There's quite a few people, regional people in the room tonight. Yeah. So I hope that you have it's piqued your interest and you'd like to come along. We'd love to see you there. If we didn't get your question tonight, we will endeavour to answer it. And the question list will actually go out, as well as the feedback form, which will come up when you finish the session tonight, when you leave the session tonight, but it'll also come to you in an email. So we'd really appreciate you filling in the feedback and letting us know what you would like to learn more about in these webinar sessions from the CBAA and the CMTO. And Jess, we thank you once again very much for tonight. It's really, really good to have all of your incredible information.
Thank you, everyone. It's been really good, and I really loved all your questions. And I'm like scrolling through all your podcast recommendations now. So
excellent. Well, I'll leave the question thing open if you want to jump in there and make some comments and answer some of those questions for people. But we'll just leave the room open for 5 more minutes or so, and so people can have those questions answered. But don't forget to jump onto the CBAA's website if you want to check out when the next webinar is on. Unfortunately, Danny had internet issues tonight, so he's had to leave us. But if you're on the social medias or the website for CBAA, you'll see when our next webinars are coming up. All right, so I'm going to finish the recording now, and we'll just stay online to answer some of those final questions.